Introduction. It is now okay. Introduction to the revised edition. 我手上拿的这本书是后来的增修版本。这个应该是再版的书，因为这本书非常的流行。It is now 10 years since the Tibetan book of living and dying was first published. In this book, I endeavored to share something of the wisdom of the tradition I grew up in. I sought to show the practical nature of its ancient teachings and the ways in which they can help us at every stage of living and dying. Many people over the years had urged me to write this book. They said it would help relieve some of the intense suffering that so many of us go through in the modern world. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama has pointed out, we are living in a society in which people find it harder and harder to show one another basic affection, and where any inner dimension to life is almost entirely overlooked. It is no wonder that there is today such a tremendous thirst for the compassion and the wisdom that spiritual teachings can offer. 这一段就提到了，这是在首版的书出版了10年以后，然后出了这个再版的书。就是这个作者本人，这个作者本人他是属于在藏传佛教的这个传统教育下长大的，同时他也接受了西方的教育，然后很多年以来，就是别人都鼓励他来写这样一本书，就是为了解脱大家的 intense suffering， 就是一些苦恼。这是第一段，现在接着我们读第二段。It must have been as a reflection of this need that the Tibetan book of living and dying was received with such enthusiasm around the world. At first, I was astonished. I had never expected it to have such an impact, especially since at the time of writing this book, death was still very much a subject that was shunned and ignored. Gradually, as I traveled to different countries, teaching and leading workshops and trainings based on the teaching in this book, I discovered the extent to which it had struck a chord in people's heart. More and more individuals came up to me and or wrote to tell me how these teachings had helped them through a crisis in their lives or supported them through the death of a loved one. And even though the teachings it contains may be unfamiliar, there are those who have told me they have read this book several times and keep returning to it as a source of inspiration. After reading the Tibetan book of living and dying, a woman in Madras in India was so inspired that she founded a medical trust with a hospice and a palliative care center. Another person in the United States came to me and said she was baffled by how a mere book could have, in her words, loved her so completely. Stories like this, so moving and so personal, testify to the power and the relevance of the Buddhist teachings today. Whenever I hear them, my heart fills with gratitude, both to the teachings themselves and to the teachers and the practitioners who have undergone so much in order to embody them and hand them on. 这一段主要就是说他这本书在过去这些年，在过去这10年，在听众的群体里面，造成了什么样的一些影响和反响？他讲到一个印度的，一个女士听了以后，就创建了一个那种临终关怀的那种医院一样的 care center。然后还有一个美国的一个人，也是一个女士，说她读了这本书以后，她感觉她的人生里面从来没有被loved her so completely。就是最终就是提到说，佛教的一些教义以及这些教育，对于当今的社会在解除个人烦恼方面会有很大的意义。那第3段 ，In time, I came to learn that the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying had been adopted by institutions, centers, and groups of various kinds, educational, medical, and spiritual. Nurses, doctors, and those professionally involved with care for the dying have told me how they have integrated these methods in their daily work. And I have heard many accounts of ordinary people using these practices and finding that they transformed the death of a friend or close relative. Something I find especially moving is that this book has been read by people with different spiritual beliefs, and they have said that it has strengthened and deepened their faith in their own tradition. They seem to recognize the universality of its message and understand that it aims not to persuade or convert, but simply to offer the wisdom of the ancient Buddhist teachings in order to bring the maximum possible benefit. 这一段还是讲就是这本书的影响力，就是他尤其提到就是对于很多甚至其他宗教的人士，他们也读这本书，他们读了这本书以后，反而更加深了他们对自己的宗教的一个信仰。比方说一个基督教的信徒，他读了这本书以后，他反而对基督教的信仰更深了。或者甚至可能穆斯林的话，他读了以后，可能对自己穆斯林的宗教信仰更深。因为这本书里所传递的信息，不是为了去 convert 其他宗教的人，让他们去把他们 convert 成一个佛教的弟子，而是说他利用这些古代的这些佛学这些教义的一些智慧，给他们带来一些 maximum possible benefit。好，下一段。As the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying quietly took on a life of its own, moving inconspicuously through many domains and disciplines, I began to understand the ultimate source of its great influence and appeal. These extraordinary teachings are the heart essence of the oral lineage, that unbroken line of wisdom passed down from a living experience over the centuries. Someone once called this book midway between a living master and a book. And it is true that both in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying and behind it, supporting it with their advice and answers to questions, are the greatest masters of our time. It is their voice that speaks through these pages, their wisdom and their vision of a compassionate world infused by the knowledge of our true nature, the innermost nature of mind. The impact of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, I believe, is due to the blessing of the lineage and the vibrancy of the oral tradition. Its popularity has been a humbling experience for me, and it has reminded me that if I have any ability to communicate these teachings, it is only because of the devotion inspired in me by the teachings and the kindness of my masters and nothing else. 这一段提到了一个很重要的2个点，就是他认为这本书他的 blessing due to the blessing of the lineage and the vibrancy of the oral tradition， 就是lineage 应该指的是就是这些佛学的思想和概念就一脉相传下来的这一点。然后另外一点就是它是一个 oral tradition， 它是一口口相传，就是 the vibrancy of the oral tradition， 就是它是一个人通过讲话对另外一个人这样相传下来。其他的就还是说这本书它对社会的影响吧。那下一段。Over these last 10 years, there have been many changes in our attitudes toward death and in the kind of care we as a society offer to the dying and the bereaved. Public awareness of death and the many issues surrounding dying has been heightened. Books, websites, conferences, serious radio and television series, films, and support groups have all contributed to a greater openness toward looking into death. There has been a considerable expansion in hospice work and palliative care, and this has been the period during which, in some countries, the whole field of care for the dying has been opened up. Initiatives of many kinds have taken place, inspired by courageous men and women, for whom I have the greatest respect and admiration. Meanwhile, there have been more and more requests for those working in the Buddhist tradition to take part in projects and explore how they can contribute. 因为这本书的一个主题就是死亡，那跟死亡比较接近的一个工作就是我们说的那种 hospice， 它是一种就是临终关怀医院一样，就是一个人在真的是无药可治，就说白了就是在等死的阶段，临终关怀的阶段，就是这本书也间接的促进了这种临终关怀工作的一个开展。下一段。A number of my friends and students have gradually created an international program of education and training based on the teachings in this book and designed to offer spiritual care to the dying, their families, and those who care for them. We offer courses for the medical profession and the public, coordinate volunteers, and have begun to work hand in hand with hospitals, clinics, hospices, and universities. what is encouraging is that there is a growing recognition everywhere that spiritual issues are central to the care of the dying. And in some countries, a number of medical schools now offer courses in spirituality and medicine. Yet I am told surveys show that denial of death still prevails, and we are still lacking in our ability to offer spiritual help and care for the dying and answer their deepest needs. The kind of death we have is so important. Death is the most crucial moment of our lives, and each and every one of us should be able to die in peace and fulfillment, knowing that we will be surrounded by the best in spiritual care. 这一段他提了一个很重要的点，就是说，现在很多人还是对死亡的态度是持一个否定的态度，就是哪怕是一个人在将死的时候，很多人他说，哎，我还不愿意死，这样的一种 denial。然后他提到的一个概念是说，每一个人在面临死亡的时候，应该会就是心情很平静的去面对死亡，就是能够 should be able to die in peace and fulfillment。然后他就是说，在这些临终的病人，他们应该受到更好的spiritual care， 就是说不光是维持他们生命的一些物质的一些 care， 更他们的精神层面也需要一些 spiritual care。下一段，If the Tibetan book of living and dying has played some small part in helping us look at how we deal with our own death and that of those around us, it is an answer to my prayers, and I'm deeply moved and grateful. It is still my dream that the teachings presented here be made available to people everywhere of all ages and at all levels of education. My original hope for this book was that it would help inspire a quiet revolution in the whole way we look at death and care for the dying. And so the whole way we look at life and care for the living. Our need for spiritual transformation and to take responsibility in the truest sense for ourselves and others has not become any less urgent these 10 years on. What would it mean if more and more people thought seriously about their future and the future of the world? Imagine how things would be if we could live our lives infusing them with a sacred meaning, if our end-of-life care were always lit by a sense of awe in the face of death, and if we looked on life and death themselves as an inseparable whole, what would be the effect of seeking to make love and compassion the measure of our every action and of understanding to any degree the inmost nature of the mind that underlies our entire existence? This would be a true revolution, one that would free men and women to discover their birthright, that inner dimension so long neglected, and unite them with the fullness of the human experience in all its mystery and grandeur. Sogyal Rinpoche, Lireblin, France. Lireblin 应该是法国的一个小地方吧，一个地名。 应该是个小地方。November 2001，这是再版的书的一个 introduction。那他提到他这个再版是在出版的就第一版本的10年以后，那就是出版大概是在1991年左右。那再版的这个 introduction 里就提到了很多第一版本的书在发行以后引起的各种各样的社会效应。在最后这一段里，我想他提到的，他把生和死作为一个整体来看待，这个是一个很重要的概念。就是我想再重复一下这段话。My original hope for this book， 就是说他对这本书的一个初衷，was it would help inspire a quiet revolution in the whole way we look at death and in the whole way we look at death and care for the dying. And so the whole way we look at life and care for the living. 我觉得这句话是一句精华的话，这个很难翻译，我也不试图去翻译的。就是说，他说，他希望这本书能够促进一场静悄悄的革命。那这个革命发生的方向就是说，我们如何看待死亡，如何去照顾将死之人。那同时呢，我们也应该有一个革命性的观念，就如何去看待生活 life， 以及如何去照顾活着的人。